Shosholoza, kulezun tabas, timelas, pume South Africa. Wenu yabaleka, kulezun tabas, timelas, pume South Africa.
Nelson Mandela and the ANC revolutionized the South African government from an apartheid system to democracy by establishing a youth program, launching a defiance campaign, creating and promoting a freedom charter, and generating multiple protests through a period of 40 years. This was a momentous reform in history because it gave all races in South Africa equal rights, and it produced a positive, influential reaction throughout South Africa and the world. Let us take you back into the year of 1943 in South Africa. This is where our story begins. In the year of 1943, 5 South African men, including Nelson Mandela, created the ANCYL, or African National Congress Youth League. The ANCYL's main goal was to galvanize the youth to step up the right against segregation within the country. Segregation in South Africa had been going on since 1918. The ANC had been created to resist racial segregation, which gave Nelson Mandela the idea for the ANC Youth League.
In 1948, the African National Party, led by Dr. Mallon, took power and set a policy of strict apartheid government. Apartheid is an African national word that means apartheid. It is the official government policy of racial segregation or keeping different races apart. The ANC's reaction to this was a defiance campaign started on April 6, 1952. Nelson Mandela was named the campaign's National Volunteer-in-Chief. The ANC's defiance campaign's mission was to get Africans involved in protesting about the apartheid government. In response to the beginning of the defiance campaign, the government showed no indication of changing its apartheid laws. In result, Nelson Mandela and the ANC formed more vigorous protests. On June 26, 1952, there was a massive national strike, and a group of people, including Mandela, were arrested. He was released from police custody the next day. The reaction to all of these protests was that Mandela was forced to resign from the ANC and was confined in Johannesburg.
In 1953, Professor Z.K. Matthews proposed the idea of creating a freedom charter to instill political consciousness in the people and encourage their political activity. In 1954, the ANC got together to begin to compose the Freedom Charter. On June 26, 1955, the Freedom Charter was adopted by a town in South Africa known as Kliptown. On this day, there was also a national day of protest called Freedom Day. The Freedom Charter outlined the democratic goals of South Africa by saying, "These freedoms we will fight for, side by side, throughout our life, until we have won our liberty." In September 1955, the police raided the homes of 500 activists, seizing documents of the Freedom Charter. They then banned the leading activists of the Freedom Charter. On December 5, 1956, 156 leading activists were put on trial, which was later known as the treason trial. Among these activists was Nelson Mandela. Ultimately, this document is what led to Nelson Mandela's imprisonment.
In December of 1956, 156 people from the Freedom Charter were arrested and charged with trying to overthrow the government. The trial of these 156 people was known as the treason trial, and it lasted more than 4 years. After this, Nelson Mandela decided to continue his work underground because he believed that he would be able to avoid police encounters. Nelson Mandela was able to stay in touch with the public, by contacting journalists to spread his work and ideas to the people of South Africa. Mandela and other ANC leaders began to meet secretly and switch to violent resistance. This would only disrupt the government property, but would not harm anyone. They formed a secret movement called Umkhonto we Sizwe. This literally translates to Spear of the Nation. They bombed power lines, power plants, and government buildings on December 16, 1961. Nelson Mandela then fled the country. These violent protests were not nearly as successful as his non-violent protests.
Out of the night.
On August 5, 1962, Nelson Mandela was caught trying to leave the country and was charged with inciting black workers to riot. In 1963, Walter Sisulu and 15 other ANC members were caught, and documents were found saying that Mandela was the leader of the Umkhonto we Sizwe movement. All of them were found guilty in June of 1964 and were sentenced to life in prison. The trial ended with this statement from Nelson Mandela.
I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunity. It is an ideal which I hope to live and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The reaction to the imprisonment of Mandela was an increase in protest violence between police and black opposition towards the government policies. In 1976, the South African police shot and killed multiple children during the Children's Revolt, which had over 20,000 schoolchildren marching in it. The black community reacted in a way that increased opposition towards the government and eventually caused the apartheid government to crumble. In the 80s, the ANC worked hard to disintegrate the apartheid laws. Eventually, they were successful. By 1988, the entire black community and other countries such as England, the Netherlands, and even the US were working to free Nelson Mandela.
On February 10, 1990, it was announced by Frederick William de Klerk, the South African president, that Nelson Mandela would be released the next day. On February 11th, shortly after he was released, he held a press conference.
I have committed myself to the promotion of peace in the country, but I have done so as part and parcel of the decisions and campaigns which have been taken and launched by the ANC.
4 years later, he was made president by the South African people in April 1994. He was the candidate of the ANC party. He then worked to keep a democracy and prove that his idea was the right decision to all races. His success was proven because in every election since, the ANC party has been elected and South Africa is still today a democracy. Other countries around the world were affected by this revolution, and some had their own possible reaction. One that we have made possible connections to is the US. One example of this is in 1952 in South Africa, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign. Later in the US, in 1954, there was a case brought to the Supreme Court, arguing for equal rights to all races in education. This case is remembered as Brown versus Board of Education. This case set off more reactions and protests in America, following the path of South Africa. After the case, American civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., started their own campaign for equal rights. We have made a connection between Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela because of their similar nonviolent ways of fighting for equality.
Ultimately, Nelson Mandela and the ANC's revolution to a democracy changed the entire South African government, giving all South Africans equal rights, which produced a positive reaction throughout the world.